It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. If you've lived in Detroit for a while, you've heard the city's revival narrative, the magazines, the national news, the awards. They all proclaim Detroit is back. But many Detroiters have bristled at this. Back from where? They never left. That phrase, Detroit never left, is the counter. It's emblazoned on T-shirts, stickers, and murals. Detroiters utter these words to take back the narrative. But from whom? My next guest makes the case that powerful outsiders have long defined Detroit's problems at the expense of residents. Nicole Trujillo-Pagán teaches sociology at Wayne State University. Her new book is titled Detroit Never Left: Black Space, White Borders, Latino Crossings. Professor Trujillo-Pagán, welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
You came to Detroit from New York in 2006. You moved to Southwest. You started teaching. And you write that your students almost immediately told you that you had it wrong, that the way you described their neighborhood wasn't the way they lived in it. What did you get wrong?
Well, we're sociologists, and so we have terms that people aren't always familiar with. But I am teaching them about what concentrated poverty is and what inner city neighborhoods are. And they didn't see their neighborhood that way at all. Of course, they traced back generations in Southwest Detroit. They had hats with Southwest pride written on them. And they were very proud of Southwest. So the whole language that I had as a sociologist seemed very alien to them. And I was clearly talking past them.
So where you saw disadvantage, they saw opportunity. They said, this is where we live, and we see a much bigger world waiting for us.
Absolutely. They were full of hope. They didn't have any of this narrative that I think I imported about lack of jobs, lots of debt, struggling with public services. They really didn't see any of that. I mean, I guess they felt, everybody has difficulty. Everybody has struggles. Why should our neighborhood be any different? But it's vibrant, and people come every summer, and, we live full, rich lives. We play in our parks. What's wrong with you?
So, Professor, you, an outsider with good intentions, showed up and defined a community's problems in a way that the community didn't recognize, or some people in the community didn't recognize. Your book argues that's not just your story, that's Detroit's story, that the people with the most power to define the city's problems were the people who understood it least and profited most. Explain.
Well, this is kind of ironic the way that it worked out. I kept trying to have this conversation in my classes, and, semester after semester, there would be this disjuncture. So, I would put the students in the research seat, and I would have them try to make sense of themselves, right, in language that would make sense at the university. And there were still these disjunctures. So finally, I went out into the field. And I started interviewing youth between the ages of 20 and 24.
Over 60 people, was it that you
No, it was
talked
over
to?
60 interviews. There were many, over 100 interviews. But with youth, there were more than 60 interviews with 20 youth. And what I learned is that I would never be able to understand Detroit unless I tried to understand it from their perspective. So as I started to collect data, I was really lucky, right, teaching at Wayne State University. Because I would come to class and I would say, can you believe this? This is what my interviewees are saying. And all of a sudden, my students would pipe up and they would say, of course that's the way it is. How is it not evident to you? And that's where I really started to learn, right? It wasn't just coming through my data, but testing and retesting my data with my students, learning that the ways Detroiters lived in the city was radically different from the way journalists talked about the city, from the way investors saw the city, and ironically, even from the way a lot of politicians see the city.
Professor, could you give me one clear example? Who defined a problem and who made money from it?
Who defined a problem and who made money from it? Well, I think we talked about a lot of people are concerned the police officers live outside of the city because it represents, again, that sort of force of outsiders having undue influence on what happens in the city. And one of the most puzzling interviews I had was a youth I interviewed 4 times. And I interviewed him 4 times because, he kept telling me about all the problems in his neighborhood, this house that had all this illegal activity at night and the police who would show up during the day. And it seemed like this cat and mouse game. And so, I'm getting the sense that this must be a very dangerous neighborhood that he lives in. And I'm concluding my interview and I say, well, so then how do you feel about your neighborhood? Again, expecting him to say, I can't wait to get out of here. And he says, I love my neighborhood. And what? Yeah, I love my neighborhood. I'm very proud of my neighborhood. It's full of hardworking people. And I said, yeah, but what about jobs? There's not a lot of jobs in the neighborhood. He goes, well, for example, my neighbor, he's always selling something. Sometimes he's selling dogs. Sometimes he's selling other things. But he's like a businessman without a degree. And I saw that here is a student who's getting a college degree, looking at his neighbor who doesn't have one, and yet seeing his entrepreneurial spirit. In other words, seeing something I would have never seen. And something an outsider would see is a criminal, right? So there's all of these surveillance companies that are making money off of criminalizing people in Detroit, but they don't see themselves as criminal. They see themselves as enterprising.
Sure. I mean, you're saying here that the more powerful entity, I guess we'll call it, that had control over the narrative was the police. But then what is above the police informing the way then that they're viewing and policing this area?
Well, it's interesting. We found, when I first got here in 2006, it was much more common that you would see people come from all over the world and they wanted to take a picture. They wanted to take pictures of things like the train depot. Right. Mm-hmm. And so they would break into the train depot, take their pictures, and then they would leave. What is now
the shiny Michigan right. Central, but at one time was the subject of great, as we call it, ruin porn.
Absolutely. And so here these people are making books, they're making magazines, they're making careers out of their photographs. Mm-hmm. They're never constructed as or seen as criminals. Meanwhile, the people who live in the same neighborhood are seen as the criminals. And I think that was the problems that they had. They saw, for example, landowners who hold these properties vacant for, decades. And that's not seen as criminal activity.
I guess I'm trying to think about, though, the overarching forces when we think about the narrative and the views of Detroit. I mean, some of the people that you point to and that you have mentioned in our discussion, the journalists, the philanthropists, the investors. I mean, I'm thinking about how you point out after the bankruptcy, Dan Gilbert, billionaire founder of Quicken Loans and the biggest private real estate holder in downtown Detroit. He was appointed to head a blight removal task force. You talk a lot about not only powerful people, but the power of language in shaping the narrative. How does a word like blight go from a description of dilapidated buildings and homes to a way of moving money?
Yeah, that's a really good, that's a really big, pot here in the Detroit area because there was a lot of money that was transacted from the city to outside contracting businesses to demolish homes. And so, yeah, there were properties that Detroiters felt they could salvage materials from or could even rehab. That nonetheless, for example, they would have their water lines cut to get them ready for demolition. So you have these very large demolition companies that came in. They didn't always, do what they were supposed to do. They would backfill, for example, with contaminated soil. They wouldn't cordon off the area where they were doing the demolitions effectively. Kids were affected.
We're seeing the fallout of contaminated soil right now in the removal of hundreds of so-called blighted homes in Detroit. We're learning about that. I mean, that had to, of course, raise your eyebrow when that news came out, back at the end of December, I want to say.
Yeah, no, it was terrible. I was sitting in the city council meeting when you had the auditor trying to explain that he had spent, I think he said 3 years trying to get the documentation for how the payments were going to the demolition contractors. So here you have, even your city government that's supposed to be protecting you and representing you, really being unable to do that. While all of these outside companies, I think we found that lead levels amongst kids increased dramatically after each one of those demolitions. So do you see the institutions that are supposed to protect you are not able to protect you, and here you're getting sick while people are making tons of money hands over fist at your expense.
My guest is Nicole Trujillo-Pagán, Associate Professor of Sociology at Wayne State University. We're talking about her new book, Detroit Never Left, Black Space, White Borders, Latino Crossings. It's out this week from NYU Press. Of course, Professor, I would be remiss not to acknowledge there were thousands of abandoned structures in this city that were genuinely dangerous.
Right.
Collapsing roofs, open foundations, kids playing in them.
Right.
And since the bankruptcy, streetlights are back on. Population loss, and I know that's a term, too, that you point out to be a bit loaded, but population loss has slowed, and there has been real investment.
Right.
This is progress that people in the city can actually see and feel. What do you say to that?
Well, so, it's funny. I even say this right in the introduction. I have a section where I talk about the forest and the trees. It's not that I don't recognize, right, that good things have happened. But I think it's important to recognize that it hasn't been good across the board and not everybody has benefited. And so I'll say two things. One, a colleague of mine writes this wonderful book, Detroit After Bankruptcy, where he looks quantitatively at a variety of measures of progress. And what he helps do is help us understand the nuance of that quote-unquote progress. That sure, you may have new residents, but at the same time that you have new areas in the Detroit city that have experienced population gain, it has been predominantly white and segregation has increased. So that's a great example, right, of something that seems good is not entirely good. In my book, where, I was focusing a lot more on Southwest Detroit, I'm able to track how you see the eastern part of Southwest Detroit along Verner. You see new businesses, you see new entrepreneurs. But by the time you get to the west side of Southwest Detroit, you see increasing poverty. In other words, people in the western part of Southwest Detroit are poorer today than they were before the bankruptcy. Their homes are worth less than they were before bankruptcy. So it's not even a question of we haven't all benefited equally. It's a relationship that I'm trying to get us to understand, that some of us have benefited while others have not.
And that kind of moves us along to one of the more controversial parts of your book, which is that this depends on your proximity to whiteness. And you focus a lot on Latinos. And you write that being Latino in this country is like driving with a side view mirror, looking forward toward what whiteness offers.
Right.
Checking behind you to make sure you don't fall into the exclusion Black residents face. What do you mean by that?
I mean, it seems just evident now, I feel, across America. In 2020, we were all looking at what happened in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and we were thinking a lot about racial profiling and policing. clearly we see that happening with ICE, right? These militarized police acting against people who live in the United States. And so I think we got the lesson of how Latinos can show us the violence of policing and surveillance. But there's a lot more that needs to be said, for example, about housing, because the group in this country that is most segregated are African Americans. And we measure segregation of Latinos relative to whites and African Americans, and we still find that African Americans are more segregated. So it happens in metropolitan area after metropolitan area that Latinos have been positioned in cities such that they keep cities alive, right? Like Southwest Detroit did, as the city became increasingly poor and lost more resources and went into debt. But at the same time, it's in a relationship relative to white investment and white populations.
It was safer. The white investors saw Southwest as the safer part of the city to invest in, and you argue that is because of its proximity to whiteness.
We do tours of Mexican town. We do tours of Chinatown. We like ethnic towns, but we don't have a black town and we don't have Africa town.
Which is another part of the book I would like to talk about, but we've run out of time. And so I'm going to encourage people to pick up your book, and I'm going to say the title in just a moment. I want to end on this note, though. What is the role of outsiders in Detroit? If they shouldn't be defining the city's terms, what should they be doing, especially if we want to be acting more as a region than as isolated communities? In the last 30 seconds that we have here.
Be more like me, who's always talking to Detroiters about what they're going through and what you think that you see, and be open to learning and being wrong about what you think you know about someone who's different from you.
Nicole Trujillo-Pagán, Associate Professor of Sociology at Wayne State University. Her new book is Detroit Never Left: Black Space, White Borders, Latino Crossings. Congrats on this.
Thank you so much.
Book.
Congrats to all of us.
Coming up, as international relations intensify and domestic conflicts raise tensions in the U.S., we'll revisit conversations about something called learned helplessness and how it shows up in our society. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is The Metro. We'll be right back after the news.